Do you condemn armed Palestinian resistance? It's a tricky question, and the answer is, wait, before I answer that, let's talk some history. First up, the story of America's first terrorist, John Brown, a devout and fierce abolitionist. John Brown wreaked havoc in the pre-Civil War American South. In 1859, Brown and 18 men seized a U.S. military arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia with the intent to disperse the weapons to black men with the hopes of waging a guerrilla war against the institution of slavery in America. During his attack, Brown and his men killed several people. His uprising was short-lived, however, as he was shortly captured, tried, and sentenced to death. But during his sentencing, Brown told the court that his actions against slavery were consistent with God's commandments. I believe, he said in a speech that electrified many Northerners who later read it, that to have interfered as I have done on behalf of his despised poor is not wrong, but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I say, let it be done. For Northerners and African Americans, Brown was a Christ-like martyr, a hero. But for Southerners, he was a terrorist. And yet these same Southerners could not acknowledge the terror they had inflicted on their slaves for as long as their country had existed. For centuries, black slaves were tortured, tarred and feathered, humiliated, dehumanized, exploited, beaten, raped, and killed at the hands of slave owners. But in the minds of the slave owners, their actions were justified, and they used religion and all sorts of perverted logic to sanitize their deranged worldview. But history knows otherwise, and more than 200 years later, John Brown, America's first terrorist, is celebrated by the American government. And he wouldn't be the only resistance fighter the world would celebrate. Let's not forget Nelson Mandela, the South African hero and Nobel Peace Prize winner, the global symbol of peace and freedom, immortalized for his struggle to end South African apartheid. He too was at one time considered a terrorist. What? Why? As part of the African National Congress, Mandela resisted South African apartheid peacefully through nonviolent protests, strikes, and boycotts. But in 1960, South African police murdered 69 protesters and declared the ANC illegal. Left with no other options and forced underground, Mandela and the ANC had no choice but to resort to armed resistance in order to achieve their liberation. Nelson Mandela even received guerrilla military training in other African nations. His armed resistance was deemed to be terrorism, not just by the Boers in South Africa, but also by the United States. Defending the shift in strategy as a last resort, Mandela said in one of his interviews from prison, the armed struggle with the authorities was forced on us by the government. But apartheid eventually collapsed, and after 27 years in prison after being captured, Mandela was freed, and he went on to become president of South Africa. Yet the US still kept him and the ANC on the terror watch list until 2008. But to the US's credit, they have supported their fair share of resistance fighters. Take the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, who resisted the USSR's invasion in the 1980s. The US funded and trained them in Afghanistan. In fact, the US Mujahideen were so beloved by the US that Hollywood romanticized them in the movie Rambo 3. Of course, the Soviets definitely saw them as terrorists. The story of powerful oppressors vilifying resistance movements is a story as old as history itself. Oppressors only come into power through violence and the use of force. And to protect their positions of power, they justify their own atrocities while vilifying and condemning the resistance of the oppressed, further driving the oppressed to acts of unfettered violence. From the slave uprisings in ancient Rome to the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto, oppressed peoples across history have risen up in armed resistance to their oppressors, at times going to any and all lengths to achieve their freedom. The Jews, caged in the Warsaw Ghetto, even made ingenious use of underground tunnels they had built to organize and carry out resistance against their Nazi oppressors. No, not those tunnels. Those are Hamas tunnels. Jewish tunnels in the Warsaw Ghetto. Yep, that's the one. Which brings us to the plight of the Palestinians. Now, we all know the story, and if we don't worry, I'm gonna tell you. In 1948, armed Zionist paramilitary groups violently ethnically cleansed Palestinian villages and laid the groundwork for the state of Israel. They killed, raped, and tortured Palestinians. This isn't my characterization of their actions, it's theirs. Just listen to the accounts of these former Zionist militants from 1948.
ודאי הרגנו בהם בלי נקיפת מצפון. הרגת, אז עשית דבר טוב.
הייתי מוכן להרוג.
אני אספר לה שאני הייתי רוצח.
עד היום לא הוציא את האקדח, טרח, הרג את כולם.
יאללה, רפו אותם כמו פרות, חניהם.
בזמן קרב, אם מישהו הרים ידיים, משהו כזה, לא לקחתי שבויים.
כמה אתה חושב אנשים הרגת ככה?
לא ספרתי. אני לא יכול לדעת בחיי.
הוא תפס אישה, חתיכה צעירה, נכנס לבית אחד, הכין חדר מיטות, עם מיטה, ורצה לזיין אותה.
הילדה חזרה, זה ילבית סמרטוטיה.
אחד אנס שם איזה ילדה בת 16, משהו כזה. אתה מבין? אבל זה מכוער מאוד. היה לנו בחור אחד, הוא נפטר, הוא היה פרא אדם. הוא לקח פשוט מאוד ורצח אותם בתוך המכלאות. חוטי ברזל כאלה, עגולים כאלה, אספו כל הגברים. הם יושבים שם, כולם, על הרצפה. ובא מישהו ולוקח תת מקלע ומתחיל זה, מחליף מחסנית, שלקחו את הלוויורים ורדפו אחרי חבר'ה ושרפו אותם. זה היה משהו זוועתי, וזה אסור לספר, אני לא אדבר על זה.
מלחמה זה מלחמה.
As a result of the violence and conquest, 750,000 Palestinians became displaced refugees. This event is known as the Nakba, meaning the catastrophe. The Palestinians and neighboring Arab states resisted, but they were powerless to stop Israel's expansion. With military and financial support from the US and Europe, Israel succeeds in winning war after war, destabilizing the region. And in the 1993 US-brokered Oslo Accords, the Palestinians agreed to lay down their arms and recognize Israel to work peacefully towards a political solution along the 1967 borders. In the decades since, Israel has not adhered to the US-brokered Oslo Accords and continues to violate international law. The Palestinians have found themselves living under a brutal military occupation that controls every aspect of their lives. Their homes are bulldozed to make way for Jewish settlers coming from New York.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is gonna steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it, ya ammi.
Their children are kidnapped and held as hostages in Israeli military prisons, sometimes for years without charge. Their land and their lives are stolen constantly by this racist and dehumanizing system of apartheid and occupation. Palestinians have resisted this brutal occupation. They've resisted it peacefully and diplomatically. The Palestinians have exhausted every option, trying over and over in peace negotiations with the Israelis, but to no avail. Sound familiar? It's no wonder Nelson Mandela and the ANC were and are staunch supporters of the Palestinian movement.
We identify with the PLO because just like ourselves, they are fighting for the right of self-determination. Choose peace rather than confrontation, except in cases where we cannot move forward. Then, if the only alternative is violence, we will use violence.
You see, despite how cartoonishly evil the Israelis try to portray the Palestinians, they do not just wake up and decide to inflict violence on people. The Palestinians have been pushed to the brink, like every other oppressed group of people throughout history, desperate to achieve some level of dignity. And the world watches and hopes the Palestinians will just accept their fate, living under the occupation and apartheid of the Israeli regime, slowly being driven further and further from their homes and their humanity. The world asks the Palestinians to suffer in silence, without protest, without resistance. That's why the world only pays attention when violence breaks out. Unconscionable violence that is deplorable. Unconscionable violence for which Israel, as the oppressive occupier, is ultimately responsible for. So my response to those who would ask if I condemn Palestinian resistance is this: do you condemn George Washington? Do you condemn John Brown? Do you condemn the slave revolts? Do you condemn Nelson Mandela? Do you condemn the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto? Do you condemn resistance in the name of liberation? History knows the answer to that question, and you do too.